Tuesday, 9:47 p.m. Rain hammered the Chicago skyline. The corporate floor sat empty. James Brooks rubbed his temples. The glow of the dual monitors painted his tired face blue. One screen held the Vanguard merger projections. The other held the real nightmare. Chicago Memorial Hospital billing statements. Chloe's name sat at the top of the invoice. 6 years old, mitral valve regurgitation. The numbers at the bottom of the page carried more weight than any corporate acquisition. 4 years since Nora passed. 4 years of carrying the sky on his shoulders alone. The medical debt formed a tightening noose. He closed the browser tab. The Vanguard numbers returned. Clean, logical, unforgiving. The desk phone shattered the silence. The caller ID flashed the executive suite. Valerie Sterling, the CEO. James stared at the blinking red light. The Ice Queen never called analysts directly. She certainly never called them at nearly 10 o'clock at night. He picked up the receiver. "My office, now." The line went dead. James grabbed his suit jacket from the back of the ergonomic chair. He smoothed the wrinkles from his slacks. A black man in a high-rise Chicago financial firm did not have the luxury of looking disheveled. Competence was his armor. Perfection was his baseline. He walked toward the glass elevators. The city lights blurred through the rain-streaked windows. The 45th floor smelled of polished mahogany and ozone. The silence here felt expensive. Valerie's corner office door stood slightly ajar. Light spilled into the darkened hallway. James knocked once. He pushed the door open. Valerie Sterling stood by the floor-to-ceiling window. She wore a tailored charcoal suit. Her posture held the rigid geometry of a woman constantly bracing for impact. 38 years old, unmarried, unreachable. She turned around. The usual sharp edge in her hazel eyes had dulled. Shadows bruised the skin beneath her lower lashes. "Close the door." James let the heavy oak click shut. The lock engaged with a soft thud. He stood before the massive marble desk. He waited. Silence stretched tight across the room. "I went to a private clinic in the suburbs this morning." Valerie walked slowly toward her desk. She did not look at him. She looked at the polished stone surface. Under an assumed name, paid in cash. James kept his face neutral. His mind raced through the Vanguard data. Did she find a leak? Did the SEC flag an anomaly? "I am pregnant." Valerie stopped behind her leather chair. Her knuckles went white against the headrest. 10 weeks. The room tilted. The hum of the HVAC system roared in James's ears. 10 weeks. The corporate retreat in Aspen. The blizzard, the grounded flights, the hotel bar, the whiskey. The one night the Ice Queen had let the mask slip, talking about the crushing weight of her father's legacy. The one night James had let himself forget the empty side of his bed. "It is yours." Valerie finally met his gaze. Her voice lacked its usual commanding resonance. It sounded brittle. James exhaled slowly. He gripped the edge of the guest chair. A child, another life. The memory of Nora's fading heartbeat in the ICU crashed into the present moment. He pushed the grief down. He needed clarity. He needed focus. Valerie opened a locked desk drawer. She pulled out a thick manila envelope. She slid it across the marble. It stopped inches from James's hand. Inside is a non-disclosure agreement. Valerie crossed her arms. Her armor was sliding back into place, and a cashier's check. $2 million. You sign away all parental rights. You maintain complete silence. The money clears tomorrow. Your daughter's medical bills disappear. You walk away. James stared at the envelope. $2 million. The exact mathematical solution to every late-night panic attack. The end of the agonizing calls with hospital billing departments. The security Nora had begged him to find for Chloe. He looked up at Valerie. She was trembling. Barely perceptible, but there. The CEO was terrified. She was trying to buy her way out of a human connection. She was treating his flesh and blood like a toxic asset. Anger, cold and pure, washed over him. He did not touch the envelope. "You researched my daughter's medical debt." James kept his voice low. The timbre resonated with absolute calm. "You weaponized my child's failing heart to secure a clean balance sheet." Valerie flinched. "It is a practical solution. The board is looking for an excuse to oust me. A scandal right now destroys the firm. It destroys my career. It destroys your career." James stood up straight. He buttoned his suit jacket. He looked at the check peeking from the flap. Then he looked Valerie directly in the eyes. "I have dignity. I deserve respect." Valerie's breath hitched. "You cannot buy my absence." James stepped back from the desk. "You cannot pay me to abandon my blood. I am a father. I will be a father to this child. Keep your money." "James, you don't understand the forces at play here." Panic bled through her executive tone. "Harrison is circling. He knows something is wrong." "Then we face Harrison." James turned toward the door. "I will be at my desk at 7 tomorrow. We will handle the Vanguard merger, and we will handle this, without the check." He walked out. The heavy door clicked shut behind him. The hallway felt colder. The $2 million sat on the marble desk, worthless against the weight of a man's character. James rode the elevator down to the parking garage. The rain had turned to sleet. Wednesday morning. The trading floor hummed with artificial urgency. James arrived at 6:45 a.m. His mind felt like shattered glass, but his suit was impeccable. He powered on his workstation. He pulled the Apex project files. Harrison Cole, the chief financial officer. The Apex acquisition was Harrison's brainchild, a mid-sized logistics firm with aggressive growth projections. Valerie had been hesitant. Harrison had been relentless. Now, with Valerie distracted by the pregnancy, Harrison was pushing for an expedited board vote. James opened the raw data logs, not the sanitized executive summaries. He dug into the ledger entries, column after column of numerical narratives. He was a master of this language. He saw the stories hidden behind the decimal points. He saw the lies. Something gnawed at his instincts. He pulled up the accounts receivable for Apex. The growth was too perfect. Real businesses suffered seasonal dips. Real businesses had erratic supply chain costs. Apex moved with a mathematical smoothness that defied reality. He cross-referenced the vendor payment histories. He matched the routing numbers against a global banking database. The breadcrumbs were microscopic. A payment to a consulting firm here, a software licensing fee there. The amounts always fell just below the mandatory audit threshold. "Working early, James?" The voice slithered over his shoulder. James did not startle. He slowly minimized the offshore routing window. He turned in his chair. Harrison Cole stood too close. He wore a bespoke navy suit that cost more than James's car. He smelled of bergamot and unearned confidence. Harrison smiled. The expression did not reach his pale eyes. "Just running the final stress tests on Apex, Harrison." James kept his tone perfectly neutral. "The board wants the vote on Friday." Harrison leaned a hand on the cubicle partition. He invaded James's space. "Valerie seems off her game lately, distracted. We need to ensure the diligence is wrapped up tightly. No delays, no sudden complications." Harrison placed a subtle emphasis on the last word. James caught the inflection. The CFO wasn't talking about spreadsheets. "The numbers will dictate the timeline." James turned back to his screen. He dismissed the executive. "I'll have the summary ready by close of business." Harrison lingered for a fraction of a second too long. Then his footsteps retreated across the carpet. James exhaled. His heart hammered against his ribs. He maximized the offshore routing window again. He traced the shell companies, a nested doll of corporate entities, Delaware, Bermuda. Finally, a holding company registered in the Cayman Islands. He pulled the incorporation documents from a deep web financial registry. The primary stakeholder of the holding company was a blind trust, but the registered agent listed a specific Chicago law firm, the same law firm that handled Harrison Cole's divorce 2 years ago. The puzzle pieces locked together with a sickening click. Apex was a hollow shell, a massive debt trap. If Sterling Acquisitions bought Apex, they were buying inflated liabilities. The purchase capital would funnel directly through the phantom vendors into Harrison's offshore trust. It was a $5 million embezzlement scheme disguised as corporate expansion. Why the rush? Harrison needed the deal closed before the quarterly external audit, and he knew Valerie was vulnerable. James leaned back in his chair. The magnitude of the threat crystallized. Harrison knew about the pregnancy. He must have access to the garage security logs. He tracked the late-night meetings. He was using the potential scandal as leverage. He would hold the truth over Valerie's head to force the Apex signature. And once the ink was dry and the money transferred, Harrison would likely leak the scandal anyway, ousting Valerie and taking the CEO seat for himself. James looked at the framed photo of Nora on his desk. She was smiling, holding a newborn Chloe. Nora had always believed in the absolute power of doing the right thing regardless of the cost. James could take the data to Valerie right now. But Valerie was panicked. She was trying to buy her way out of trouble. She might use the data to cut a deal with Harrison. She might trade her silence for his. No, James had to build an airtight case. He had to gather undeniable, irrefutable proof. He needed transaction IDs. He needed IP logs. He needed to corner Harrison completely. He spent the next 10 hours locked in a digital labyrinth. He skipped lunch. He ignored the office chatter. He compiled the evidence into an encrypted flash drive. He built the weapon that could save the company. He built the weapon that could destroy the man threatening his unborn child. Thursday evening. James pushed his front door open. The smell of baked chicken and green beans filled the small hallway. Mrs. Higgins, the elderly neighbor who watched Chloe after school, emerged from the kitchen. She wiped her hands on a floral apron. "She had a good day, Mr. Brooks." Mrs. Higgins kept her voice low, but she was a bit breathless after the stairs. I made her sit and do her coloring. Fear, cold and familiar, spiked in James's chest. "Did she need the oxygen?" "No, just rest." Mrs. Higgins patted his arm. "She's a strong girl, like her mother." James thanked her and paid her for the week. He walked into the living room. Chloe lay on the rug on her stomach. Her bare feet kicked gently in the air. She gripped a blue crayon in her small fist. Her breathing was even, but there was a faint bluish tint to her nail beds, the telltale sign of the failing valve. "Hey, Bug!" James knelt beside her. Chloe rolled over. She possessed a missing front tooth and eyes that saw entirely too much for a 6-year-old. She dropped the crayon. She threw her arms around his neck. James buried his face in her curls. He inhaled the scent of strawberry shampoo and childhood innocence. "Are you fighting bad guys, Daddy?" Chloe asked. She pulled back and studied his face. "You have your fighting face on." James managed a tired smile. He tapped her nose. "Just numbers, Bug. Just fighting numbers." "Numbers can be bad guys." Chloe stated it as a profound fact. She handed him the paper she had been working on. It was a drawing of a tall building. Dark storm clouds gathered above it. At the top of the building stood a stick figure wearing a crown. The figure was surrounded by jagged red leaves. "Who is this?" James asked softly. "The lady with no smile." Chloe pointed to the crowned figure. "She lives in the sky, but it's raining up there." James stared at the crude crayon lines. The child's intuition was staggering. She had never met Valerie Sterling. She only knew the stories James occasionally told about the demanding boss in the glass tower. Yet Chloe had captured the absolute isolation of the Ice Queen. "We need to get her an umbrella," Chloe added. She picked up a yellow crayon. "Maybe we do." James watched his daughter color. He carried Chloe up to bed an hour later. He read her a story about a brave mouse navigating a dark forest. He did all the voices. He roared for the owl. He squeaked for the mouse. Chloe laughed until her chest hitched and she started to cough. James immediately stopped. He reached for the water glass on the nightstand. He helped her take slow sips. He waited until the coughing subsided and her breathing returned to a normal rhythm. He adjusted the blankets. He kissed her forehead. "I love you, Daddy," Chloe murmured. Her eyes were already drifting shut. "I love you more, Bug." He sat in the dark hallway for a long time after she fell asleep. The silence of the house pressed against his eardrums. He thought about the $2 million. He could have taken the check. He could have scheduled the experimental valve replacement surgery tomorrow. He could have guaranteed Chloe's safety. But Nora's voice echoed in his memory. Clear and uncompromising, you cannot build a foundation on a lie. The rot always climbs upward. Taking the money meant abandoning another child. It meant teaching Chloe that people were disposable commodities. It meant becoming the kind of man who belonged in a boardroom with Harrison Cole. He would find another way to pay for the surgery. He would use his firm health insurance. He would take out loans. He would sell the house. He would strip his life to the studs, but he would not sell his soul. He had dignity. He would maintain it. Friday passed in a haze of corporate paranoia. Harrison was watching him. James felt the CFO's gaze from across the trading floor. James finalized the Apex report. He delivered the sanitized version, the one Harrison expected, to the executive assistant. He kept the encrypted flash drive locked in his briefcase. The tension spiked at 4 p.m. An all-staff email arrived. Valerie Sterling was calling an emergency senior leadership meeting for next Wednesday. Harrison Cole copied the department heads. He added a single sentence. "Looking forward to finalizing the Apex integration and discussing leadership transitions." It was a public declaration of war. Harrison was making his move. Saturday morning, 8:15 a.m. The Chicago suburbs lay under a thick blanket of gray clouds. The air felt heavy with impending rain. James stood in the small kitchen. He flipped a pancake in the cast-iron skillet. The smell of vanilla and browned butter filled the room. Chloe sat at the Formica table. She wore oversized pajamas featuring cartoon dinosaurs. She was carefully organizing her crayons by color. She looked pale this morning. The shadows under her eyes were pronounced. "Syrup or powdered sugar?" James asked. He slid a perfect golden circle onto her plate. "Both," Chloe stated firmly. "It's the weekend. Rules are suspended." James chuckled. He reached for the syrup dispenser. A sharp knock at the front door froze him. He glanced at the microwave clock. 8:30 a.m. He wasn't expecting a package. He wasn't expecting anyone. He set the syrup down. He walked through the living room. He looked through the peephole. His breath caught. Valerie Sterling stood on his front porch. She did not look like the CEO. The sharp suits were gone. She wore a simple beige trench coat over dark jeans and a cashmere sweater. Her hair was pulled back in a loose ponytail. She looked smaller without the architecture of the corporate high-rise surrounding her. She looked exhausted. James unlocked the deadbolt. He opened the door. The damp morning air rushed in. They stared at each other for a long moment. The contrast between them was stark. The black analyst in a flour-dusted apron. The wealthy white executive standing on a cracked concrete porch. "You did not cash the check." Valerie's voice was quiet. It lacked the usual absolute authority. "I told you my terms." James did not step aside. He held the doorframe. "I am not for sale." "James, please." Valerie glanced nervously toward the street. A black town car idled at the curb. "I cannot have this conversation in a hallway. Let me come in. We need to renegotiate." James hesitated. He thought about Chloe sitting at the kitchen table. He thought about the encrypted flash drive sitting in his briefcase upstairs. The collision of his two worlds felt inevitable. He stepped back. He opened the door wider. Valerie walked into the modest living room. She moved carefully. She took in the worn couch, the stack of medical bills organized on the side table, the framed photographs of Nora lining the mantel. Her gaze lingered on a picture of Nora laughing, holding James's face in her hands. Valerie's expression tightened. A fleeting look of profound loss crossed her features. She recognized the presence of a love she had never experienced. "You have a beautiful home." The compliment sounded awkward, unpracticed. "State your business, Valerie." James closed the front door. "My daughter is eating breakfast." "Daddy?" Chloe appeared in the archway connecting the kitchen to the living room. She held a half-eaten pancake in one hand. She stared at the stranger in the trench coat. Valerie froze. She looked at the little girl. She looked at the missing front tooth, the messy curls, the oversized dinosaur pajamas. The reality of a child suddenly materialized before her. This wasn't a hypothetical concept in a boardroom. This was a living, breathing person. "Hello." Valerie's voice was barely a whisper. Chloe stepped into the living room. She walked right up to Valerie. She tilted her head back and studied the CEO with intense scrutiny. Children possess a terrifying ability to see through armor. "You are the lady from the sky," Chloe announced. Valerie blinked. Confusion fractured her composure. "Excuse me?" Chloe turned around. She ran back to the kitchen table. She grabbed the piece of paper she had colored on Thursday night. She trotted back to the living room. She held it out to Valerie. "I drew a picture of you." Chloe offered the paper. "Daddy said you were fighting numbers. I said you needed an umbrella because it's raining where you live." Valerie slowly reached out. Her hand trembled slightly. She took the drawing. She looked at the stick figure with the crown. She looked at the jagged red lines of the storm. She looked at the words Chloe had written at the bottom in uneven block letters. "The lady with no smile." The Ice Queen broke. It wasn't a dramatic shattering. It was a quiet, devastating collapse. Valerie's shoulders dropped. The rigid line of her jaw softened. A single tear escaped her right eye and tracked silently down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. She simply stared at the crayon drawing. "Thank you," Valerie whispered to the child. "It is beautiful." "You're welcome," Chloe smiled. The gap-toothed grin radiated absolute warmth. "Do you want a pancake? Rules are suspended today." "Chloe, go finish your breakfast," James spoke gently. He moved between his daughter and the CEO. "Ms. Sterling and I have to talk about work." Chloe nodded. She marched back to the kitchen. James turned back to Valerie. She was still staring at the drawing. The armor was completely gone. She looked like a woman who had just realized she was drowning. "Harrison sent me an email." Valerie finally spoke. She did not look up from the paper. "He knows about the clinic. He has the billing records. He threatened to leak them to the board if I don't sign the Apex authorization by Monday." The confirmation settled over James like a heavy stone. His forensic analysis was correct. The trap was sprung. "He is blackmailing you." James stated the fact cleanly. "Yes." Valerie looked up. Her hazel eyes were raw with panic. "If I sign it, I saddle the company with a terrible acquisition. If I don't sign it, he exposes the pregnancy. The board fires me for a morality clause violation. I lose everything my father built. I lose the only thing I have." She stepped toward James. The desperation in her posture was absolute. "I will double the check. 4 million. You take it, you disappear. I tell Harrison I terminated the pregnancy. The scandal dies, the leverage disappears. I fire him later." "No." The word fell like an iron gate. "James, I am begging you." Valerie's voice cracked. "You cannot fight a man like Harrison. He destroys people. He will destroy your career. He will ensure you never work in finance in this city again. Think about your daughter. Think about her medical bills. I am thinking about her." James did not raise his voice. He commanded the room entirely with his presence. "I am thinking about the man she needs me to be." He walked over to the mantel. He picked up the photograph of Nora. He held it for a moment, drawing strength from the memory of her unyielding moral compass. He set it back down gently. Intent doesn't erase impact. James turned back to Valerie. You intend to save your career by erasing my child. By paying me to abandon my blood, I will not allow it. Valerie dropped her gaze. She wrapped her arms around her stomach, a protective gesture she clearly didn't even realize she was making. Then I am dead, she whispered. Harrison wins. Harrison is a thief. James crossed the room. He stood directly in front of her. The Apex deal isn't a bad acquisition. It's a $5 million embezzlement scheme. He built a network of offshore shell companies. The purchase capital goes straight into his blind trust in the Caymans. Valerie's head snapped up. Shock wiped the despair from her face. What? That's impossible. The external auditors look at the sanitized ledgers. James interrupted. I looked at the routing numbers, I tracked the IP logs, I have the incorporation documents, I built the entire chain of custody. Valerie stared at him. The CEO was suddenly looking at the analyst, truly seeing his brilliance for the first time. You have proof? I have an encrypted drive upstairs that will send Harrison Cole to federal prison for wire fraud. James held her gaze. The power dynamic in the room shifted entirely. The employee was holding the life raft. The executive was drowning. Give it to me. Valerie reached out. I can take it to the board chair privately. I can force Harrison to resign quietly. I can save the company. No. Valerie recoiled as if struck. Why? Because if you do it quietly, you are still hiding. James stepped closer. You use the data to cut a deal. Harrison walks away rich. You keep your secret, and nothing changes. The system remains corrupt. What do you want? Valerie asked. Her voice trembled. I want you to stop running. James spoke the words with brutal honesty. You are terrified of this pregnancy. You are terrified of losing control. You are terrified of connection because connection means vulnerability. He gestured around the modest living room. You came into my home to buy your way out of a human reality. You cannot buy this. You have to live it. Valerie looked at the drawing in her hand, the lady with no smile. You have a choice, Valerie. James's voice softened slightly. The harsh truth required a gentle delivery. You can sign the Apex deal, succumb to the blackmail, and lose your company to a thief. You can try to pay me off, abort the child, and return to your glass tower alone. He paused. He let the silence emphasize the final option. Or you can stand with me. James held out his hand. He did not offer the flash drive. He offered an alliance. We take the evidence to the board together. We expose Harrison publicly. We tell the truth about the pregnancy. You stop being the Ice Queen. You start fighting for the life growing inside you. Valerie looked at his outstretched hand, the calluses on his palm, the steady strength in his fingers. She had spent her entire life building walls. She had spent her entire career demanding absolute perfection from herself to avoid exactly this kind of mess. To take his hand meant stepping into the chaos. It meant public scandal. It meant admitting weakness. It also meant she wouldn't be alone. From the kitchen, the sound of a small glass shattering echoed through the house. James spun around. The negotiation evaporated. He sprinted through the archway. Valerie rushed closely behind him. Chloe lay on the linoleum floor. The glass of orange juice was shattered around her. The orange liquid pooled around the ceramic shards. Her small hands clutched her chest. Her eyes were rolled back. Her lips were turning a terrifying shade of blue. Chloe! James dropped to his knees. He slid across the spilled juice. He pulled his daughter into his arms. Her skin was ice cold. Her breathing was a ragged, shallow wheeze. The mitral valve. It was failing. Call 911! James roared. The calm analyst vanished. The terrified father took over. He tilted Chloe's head back. He checked her airway. Valerie didn't hesitate. She didn't freeze. The executive training kicked in. She pulled her phone from her trench coat pocket. She dialed the numbers. She barked the address into the receiver with absolute clarity. She requested an advanced life support ambulance. She reported a pediatric cardiac emergency. James held Chloe tight against his chest. He rocked her gently. He murmured her name over and over. "Stay with me, Bug. Stay with me. Daddy's here." Valerie ended the call. She dropped to her knees on the floor beside them. She didn't care about the spilled juice soaking into her designer jeans. She looked at the small, fragile child gasping for air. She looked at the strong, competent man completely undone by terror. She reached out. Her trembling hand bypassed the logic of the corporate world. She placed her palm flat against James's back, a physical anchor in the storm. "They are 2 minutes away." Valerie's voice was steady, more resolve than hope. "She is going to be all right, James. We are going to make sure she is all right." James looked up at her. The tears streaked down his face. In that agonizing moment on the kitchen floor, the battle lines dissolved. The $2 million meant nothing. The Vanguard merger meant nothing. The only currency that mattered was breath. The distant wail of the ambulance siren cut through the Chicago morning. Valerie looked down at Chloe's pale face. She felt a sudden sharp flutter low in her own abdomen, a physical echo of the life growing inside her. A fierce, terrifying wave of protective instinct crashed over her. She realized with absolute clarity that the Ice Queen was dead. She looked at James. She squeezed his shoulder. "We fight this right," Valerie promised. The vow hung in the air, heavy with consequence. The sirens grew louder, drowning out the silence of the suburban street, signaling the end of the negotiation and the beginning of the war. The sterile sting of rubbing alcohol and bleached hospital linens clung to James's clothes. The morning emergency room visit had been a brutal dress rehearsal for the nightmare hanging over his life. Intravenous fluids and oxygen had stabilized Chloe's erratic heartbeat, returning the color to her lips and the fierce spark to her eyes. The pediatric cardiologist had been uncompromising. The valve was deteriorating faster than the initial models predicted. The timeline for the mandatory surgical intervention had shrunk from months to weeks. The medical debt, already a suffocating weight, was about to multiply exponentially. Valerie rode in the passenger seat of James's aging sedan on the way back to the suburbs. She had dismissed her private driver with a curt text message from the ER waiting room. The CEO of Sterling Acquisitions sat perfectly still. Her designer trench coat wrinkled, her gaze fixed on the endless gray stretch of the Kennedy Expressway. The silence inside the car hummed with unspoken revelations. The impenetrable barrier between the executive suite and the working-class reality of her senior analyst had been permanently shattered on a linoleum kitchen floor. Rain lashed against the windshield in angry driving sheets. James kept his hands fixed at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel. He watched the taillights of a semi-truck bleeding red across the wet asphalt. His mind ran parallel calculations, measuring the exact cost of the impending open-heart surgery against the threat waiting in Harrison Cole's office. A lesser man would have broken. A lesser man would have taken the $2 million, sacrificed his moral architecture, and purchased his daughter's safety with a lie. Nora's memory surfaced in the rhythmic thrum of the windshield wipers. 4 years ago, he had held Nora's hand in a room that smelled exactly like the one they had just left. The cancer had stripped away everything but her fierce, defining clarity. She had made him swear to raise their daughter in the light of truth, to never let fear dictate the boundaries of his character. James tightened his grip on the leather steering wheel. He would not violate that oath. He carried a sleeping Chloe up the front steps of their home. Valerie followed silently, holding the small backpack containing a half-finished coloring book and a broken yellow crayon. The house felt colder than it had a few hours ago. The shattered glass and pooled orange juice still stained the kitchen floor, a violent monument to the morning's terror. James laid Chloe gently on the worn living room sofa. He draped a thick, crocheted blanket over her small shoulders. He walked into the kitchen, retrieved a broom and a heavy roll of paper towels, and knelt on the linoleum. He worked methodically, sweeping the dangerous shards into a dustpan, scrubbing the sticky residue until the floor squeaked. He found solace in the mechanical action. It was a problem with a defined solution, unlike the failing biology of his child or the offshore accounts of a corrupt executive. Valerie stood in the archway. She watched the meticulous care he applied to the mundane task. She had spent her entire adult life commanding armies of corporate attorneys, restructuring billion-dollar portfolios and firing department heads without a second thought. Yet watching this man clean a floor to protect his daughter's bare feet commanded a level of respect she had never granted anyone in a boardroom. "You should go home." James threw the soaked paper towels into the trash basin. He did not look at her. "The shock has worn off. You have a company to protect. Harrison is waiting." "I am not leaving." Valerie stepped into the kitchen. The fluorescent overhead light caught the exhaustion mapping her features. "The company feels remarkably irrelevant at this exact moment. It won't feel irrelevant on Monday morning." James washed his hands at the stainless steel sink. "Harrison has the security logs. He has the dates of our late-night meetings. He has the clinic invoice. He will present you with an ultimatum to sign the Apex acquisition or face absolute professional ruin. Then we build the defense." Valerie crossed her arms, shivering slightly in the damp air. "You said you have the data. You said you tracked the IP logs and the offshore routing numbers. We spend the weekend building an ironclad dossier against him." James dried his hands on a faded towel. He looked at the woman carrying his unborn child. The pregnancy had not yet manifested physically, but the biological reality had already dismantled her emotional fortifications. She was terrified, yet she was choosing to stay in a suburban kitchen instead of retreating to her luxury penthouse. "The data is encrypted." James leaned against the counter. "It proves Harrison orchestrated a $5 million embezzlement scheme disguised as corporate expansion. But data requires a delivery mechanism. If you take this to the board while he holds the blackmail material, it becomes a mutual destruction pact. He will claim you fabricated the evidence to cover up your own moral turpitude. The board will panic. They will freeze the acquisition, but they will also terminate your contract to protect the stock price." "I don't care about the contract anymore." The words hung in the quiet kitchen. Valerie seemed shocked that she had spoken them aloud. For 20 years, Sterling Acquisitions had been her only identity. Her father had built the empire by systematically excising any human vulnerability from his decision-making. He had taught her that affection was a liability and mercy was a rounding error. She had worn the title of Ice Queen as a badge of honor. Now, staring at a widowed father fighting for his daughter's life, the crown felt entirely worthless. "You care about the legacy." James moved past her, walking back into the living room to check Chloe's breathing. "And you care about the truth. We don't detonate the evidence wildly. We let Harrison overextend his position. We let him commit to the lie on the record." Twilight descended over Chicago, painting the suburban streets in deep purples and bruised grays. The rain finally slowed to a persistent drizzle. Chloe woke up irritable and hungry. The hospital sedatives had worn off, leaving behind a profound physical ache. She refused to eat the chicken soup James heated on the stove. She refused to drink the electrolyte solution. She crossed her arms, tucked her chin into her chest, and demanded a story. "I need the book with the wild things." Chloe's voice rasped. She coughed, a dry, terrifying sound that made James's heart skip a beat. "I'll read it, Bug." James reached for the worn hardcover sitting on the coffee table. "No." Chloe pointed a small, defiant finger at the far side of the room. "The lady with no smile has to read it. She needs to practice." Valerie froze near the mantel. She looked at the child, then at the book in James's hand. Panic, sharper and more immediate than any corporate crisis, flared in her chest. She had never read a bedtime story. She had never interacted with a child for longer than a polite photo opportunity at a charity gala. "Chloe, Ms. Sterling is very tired," James offered a gentle correction. "I want her to read it." Chloe set her jaw. The stubbornness was a direct inheritance from Nora. Valerie looked at James. He offered a slight, almost imperceptible nod. It was a permission to cross the boundary. She walked slowly toward the sofa. She sat rigidly on the edge of the cushions, leaving a vast expanse of fabric between herself and the little girl. James handed her the book. The cardboard cover felt alien in her hands. She opened to the first page. She cleared her throat. The executive cadence immediately took over. "The night Max wore his wolf suit and made mischief of one kind and another." Valerie read the words with the precise, flat intonation of presenting a quarterly earnings report. She maintained a steady, emotionless rhythm, treating the whimsical illustrations as data points on a graph. "Stop!" Chloe frowned. She shifted her weight, ignoring the fatigue in her chest. "You are reading it like a robot. The monsters are not robots." Valerie stared at the page, her face flushed with a sudden, intense embarrassment. "I apologize, I am not accustomed to this material. The monster has to sound real but not mean," Chloe instructed, her tone possessing the absolute authority of a 6-year-old expert. "Like they are big, but they still get sad. You have to do the voice." James stood in the archway connecting the living room to the hallway. He leaned his shoulder against the doorframe, watching the collision of two completely different universes. Valerie swallowed hard. She looked at the illustration of the terrible yellow eyes and the terrible claws. She thought about the absolute terror she felt waking up alone in her penthouse, realizing a new life was growing inside her. She thought about the suffocating pressure of Harrison's blackmail. She thought about the vast, terrifying wilderness of vulnerability she was stepping into. She took a deep breath. She lowered the register of her voice. She added a gravelly, resonant texture to her throat, and they roared their terrible roars and gnashed their terrible teeth. It wasn't perfect. It was hesitant and slightly awkward, but it was genuine. Valerie leaned closer to the center of the sofa. She turned the page, her voice swelling with the narrative tide, finding a rhythmic pulse that had absolutely nothing to do with corporate efficiency. She gave the monsters doubt. She gave the wild things a profound, aching loneliness. Chloe's eyes widened with approval. She uncrossed her arms. She slid across the cushions, closing the distance between them. Without asking permission, the little girl leaned her head against Valerie's shoulder, seeking the ambient warmth of another human being. Valerie stopped reading. The air vanished from her lungs. The physical contact was a localized electric shock. She felt the slight, irregular flutter of Chloe's damaged heart beating against her own arm. Simultaneously, an inexplicable phantom pressure tightened low in her abdomen. The child beside her, the child inside her, the dual realities crashed together with overwhelming force. The Ice Queen's armor did not simply crack, it vaporized. Tears spilled over her lower lashes. They fell silently, tracking through the expensive foundation, dropping onto the glossy pages of the book. She did not sob. She did not shake. She simply wept with the profound, devastating relief of a woman who had finally stopped holding her breath after 2 decades of defensive isolation. James remained perfectly still in the doorway. He witnessed the emotional breakthrough with a quiet, fierce respect. He saw the exact moment Valerie Sterling stopped being an executive attempting to manage a crisis and became a mother terrified of the love expanding in her chest. "Keep reading," Chloe mumbled, her eyes drifting shut, entirely oblivious to the seismic psychological shift occurring inches away from her face. "You're getting better at it." Valerie wiped her face with the back of her trembling hand. She cleared the emotion from her throat. She lowered her voice back into the gravelly register. She finished the story, reading the final pages with a raw, unprotected tenderness that filled the small suburban living room with an absolute, undeniable grace. Monday morning brought the brutal re-entry into the atmosphere of sterling acquisitions. The transition from the intimate vulnerability of the weekend to the sterile hostility of the 45th floor felt like stepping into an airlock. James arrived at 6:30 a.m. He wore his darkest suit. He carried his encrypted flash drive in his interior breast pocket, the metal casing pressing against his ribs like a concealed weapon. The corporate silence was toxic. It wasn't the usual quiet of early morning productivity. It was the hushed, expectant stillness of a trap waiting to snap shut. At 9:15 a.m., the email arrived in James's inbox. A calendar invitation. One attendee, Harrison Cole. The location was the CFO's private suite. The subject line was a single word: compliance. James locked his workstation. He walked across the trading floor. He felt the subtle shift in the ambient energy. Analysts and junior partners averted their eyes. Conversations dropped to whispers as he passed the glass-walled conference rooms. The systemic machinery of corporate rumor had already been primed. Harrison was laying the groundwork for a public execution. The door to the CFO's suite was heavy, soundproofed mahogany. James knocked once and entered without waiting for a response. Harrison Cole sat behind an expansive desk carved from a single slab of obsidian. The Chicago skyline loomed behind him, framed by the floor-to-ceiling windows, positioning the executive as a master of the vertical universe. Several manila folders lay perfectly aligned on the dark stone surface. "Close the door, James." Harrison did not look up from the document he was reviewing. James shut the door. He did not sit in the low-slung leather guest chairs designed to put visitors at a physical disadvantage. He stood squarely in the center of the room. He projected an aura of absolute, immovable competence. Harrison finally closed the document. He folded his hands precisely. A predatory smile touched the corners of his mouth. "I have always admired your trajectory here, James." Harrison's voice dripped with a terrifying artificial warmth. A black man climbing to senior analyst in a firm historically dominated by legacy wealth. It requires a certain ruthless pragmatism, a willingness to leverage whatever assets are at your disposal to secure your position. The racist undertone was not subtle. It was a bludgeon wrapped in velvet. It was the age-old accusation that a minority could never achieve power through pure merit, that there must be a backdoor, a compromise, a manipulation. James's jaw tightened. The anger burned cold and bright behind his eyes. He recognized the tactic. Harrison was attempting to induce a defensive emotional response. He refused to give the CFO the satisfaction. "My trajectory is built on 12,000 hours of forensic data modeling and a 98% accuracy rate on market projections." James kept his voice completely flat. "If you have a question regarding my professional competence, I suggest we involve human resources. Human resources is precisely why you are standing here." Harrison opened the top manila folder. He slid 3 glossy photographs across the obsidian desk. The first photograph was a still frame from the underground parking garage security camera. Timestamp, 11:45 p.m., 3 months ago. James and Valerie standing by the elevators, standing much closer than professional distance demanded. The second photograph was from the lobby camera of the private suburban medical clinic. Timestamp, Tuesday morning. Valerie entering the facility under the glaring fluorescent lights. The third photograph was the kill shot, a printout of the $2 million cashier's check requisition form, authorized by Valerie's personal holding account, drawn the exact same day she called James into her office. "You see the narrative this creates, James?" Harrison leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. The ambitious widower, the lonely, powerful CEO, A late-night indiscretion resulting in a catastrophic complication, and suddenly a $2 million payout is generated to secure the silence of the employee who manipulated his way into her bed. Harrison paused, letting the toxic fiction settle into the air. If this dossier reaches the board of directors, Valerie will be immediately terminated for catastrophic lack of judgment and violation of the morality clause. But you, James, you will be destroyed. You will be branded an extortionist, a predator who targeted a vulnerable executive. The media will consume you. You will never walk onto a trading floor in the United States again. James looked at the photographs. The architecture of Harrison's blackmail was flawlessly constructed. It utilized the systemic biases of the corporate world against them. The board would absolutely believe the narrative of the predatory minority employee and the compromised female executive. It was a story the world was already primed to accept. You did not call me here to fire me. James met Harrison's pale eyes. If destruction was your goal, this dossier would already be in the chairman's inbox. You are exceptionally bright. That is why I want to offer you an exit strategy. Harrison opened the second folder. He produced a single sheet of heavily watermarked legal paper, a pre-drafted letter of resignation. You sign this. Harrison tapped the signature line with an expensive fountain pen. You cite insurmountable personal stress, but more importantly, you sign this attached addendum. You confess to independently falsifying the risk assessment models on the Apex acquisition to inflate your own quarterly bonus metrics. You take the blame for the bad data. The trap snapped shut with devastating clarity. Harrison needed a scapegoat for the offshore embezzlement scheme. If James confessed to manipulating the data, the board would approve the acquisition without a second thought, believing the errors were the result of a rogue employee rather than systemic fraud. Harrison would get his $5 million. Valerie would be forced to keep her mouth shut to protect her own reputation. James would take the fall. You sacrifice my integrity to cover your theft. James stated the reality plainly. I offer you a lifeline. Harrison stood up, leaning aggressively over the desk. You sign the paper. You walk away today. I bury the photographs. I ensure the $2 million payout goes through without a flag. You get the money to fix your daughter's defective heart, and you disappear quietly. If you refuse, I detonate the dossier at 2 o'clock this afternoon. You lose your job, you lose your reputation, you go to prison for extortion, and your daughter dies waiting for a charity surgery. The sheer breathtaking evil of the proposition sucked the oxygen from the room. Harrison had calculated every variable. He had found the absolute pressure point. He was using a child's failing biology to leverage corporate treason. James looked at the fountain pen. He thought about the crushing medical debt. He thought about the terrifying blue tint to Chloe's lips on the kitchen floor. He could end the terror right now. He could sign his name, destroy his soul, and buy her life. Nora's voice echoed in the soundproofed room. You cannot rebuild a soul. James did not reach for the pen. He reached inside his breast pocket. He touched the outline of the encrypted flash drive. He felt the cold, hard reality of the truth. He locked eyes with the executive. Dignity isn't a currency you can trade. Harrison's smile vanished. The mask of civility dropped, revealing the absolute malice underneath. You are making a catastrophic miscalculation, James. You are a disposable asset. I am the architect of this firm. I will crush you. A lie only has power until the lights come on. James turned his back on the CFO. He walked toward the heavy mahogany door. Do what you feel you must, Harrison. I will be at my desk. He walked out of the suite. His legs felt like lead, but his spine was perfectly straight. He had crossed the Rubicon. There was no retreat. He returned to his cubicle. He did not open the Vanguard files. He plugged the encrypted flash drive into the terminal. He began the final dangerous process of mapping the Cayman Island routing numbers directly to Harrison Cole's internal employee identification code. He was preparing the kill shot. The pressure cooker hissed for 3 agonizing days. Tuesday and Wednesday passed in a blur of escalating paranoia. Valerie canceled all her meetings, locking herself in the executive suite, communicating with James only through encrypted text messages. Harrison stalked the floor, his presence a constant physical threat. The atmosphere grew thick with the impending explosion. Thursday afternoon at 2:14 p.m., the explosion arrived. It did not come from the boardroom. It came from a ringing cellular phone. James stared at the caller ID. Lincoln Elementary School. The bottom fell out of his stomach. He answered the call before the second ring. "Mr. Brooks." The school nurse's voice trembled with a terrifying lack of professional detachment. "It's Chloe. She collapsed on the playground. She is unresponsive. The paramedics are loading her into the ambulance now. They are transporting her to Northwestern Memorial." The phone slipped from his fingers. It hit the carpeted floor with a dull thud. James didn't remember grabbing his coat. He didn't remember sprinting past the security desk or navigating the labyrinth of the parking garage. The drive across the city was a violent blur of blaring horns, screeching tires, and absolute blinding panic. He abandoned the sedan in the emergency drop-off lane. He shattered the automatic doors of the ER waiting room, a man entirely consumed by the terror of impending loss. The smell of iodine and floor wax hit him like a physical blow. The cacophony of the trauma center, the rhythmic hiss of ventilators, the sharp beeping of cardiac monitors, the low, urgent voices of medical personnel, overwhelmed his senses. He grabbed the front desk nurse by the shoulders, his voice a raw, animal demand for his daughter's location. They led him to Trauma Bay 4. Chloe looked impossible small amidst the chaotic architecture of the life-saving equipment. Tubes snaked from her arms. A heavy oxygen mask obscured her face. The cardiac monitor above her bed traced a ragged, terrifyingly uneven green line. Dr. Eris, the lead pediatric cardiovascular surgeon, stood by the monitor. His scrubs were stained. His expression offered no false comfort. "The mitral valve suffered a catastrophic prolapse, Mr. Brooks." Dr. Eris spoke with the blunt precision required in life-or-death scenarios. "The regurgitation is severe. Her heart is drowning in its own blood flow. We managed to stabilize the rhythm temporarily with a massive dose of antiarrhythmics, but she is hovering on the edge of complete heart failure." James gripped the metal railing of the hospital bed. His knuckles turned white. He stared at his daughter's chest, watching the shallow, labored rise and fall. "When do we operate?" "We cannot wait for the elective schedule." Dr. Eris pulled a digital tablet from his coat. "The window is closing rapidly. I need to take her into the surgical theater by Monday morning at the latest. We have to replace the valve completely." "Do it," James's voice cracked. "Do whatever it takes." Dr. Eris hesitated. He looked down at the tablet. The administrative reality intruded upon the medical emergency. "Mr. Brooks, the emergency intervention and the subsequent pediatric ICU recovery. The costs are going to be astronomical. I have to ask the billing department to verify the insurance pre-authorization for a non-elective catastrophic procedure of this magnitude. Your current firm policy has a maximum lifetime pediatric cardiology cap. This surgery will shatter it by several $100,000. We need a secondary guarantee of funds by tomorrow afternoon to secure the surgical theater." The words slammed into James with the force of a freight train. Several $100,000 by tomorrow afternoon. He had nothing. He had drained his savings for the initial diagnostics. He had mortgaged the house. He was standing at the edge of the abyss, watching his daughter slip over the edge, and the hospital was demanding a toll he could not pay. He stumbled out of the trauma bay. The fluorescent lights in the hallway buzzed with a sickening intensity. He hit the wall, his back sliding down the cool plaster until he hit the linoleum floor. He pulled his knees to his chest. He buried his face in his hands. The competent, unbreakable analyst finally shattered. The grief and the terror ripped a ragged sob from his throat. Hours passed in the sterile purgatory of the pediatric ICU waiting room. The late-night stillness amplified the sound of every footstep. The stale coffee in the styrofoam cup grew cold. At 11:30 p.m., the elevator doors slid open. Valerie stepped into the waiting room. She wore dark slacks and a simple silk blouse. The corporate armor was entirely absent. Her face was pale, drawn tight with anxiety. She had tracked his location through his emergency contact ping on the company network. She saw him sitting in the plastic chair, folded over himself, a portrait of absolute devastation. She crossed the room rapidly. She sat beside him. She did not ask for a status update. She did not offer hollow platitudes. She simply reached out and took his hand, gripping his fingers with a desperate strength. "The valve is tearing," James whispered to the floor. The words tasted like ash. "They have to operate by Monday. They need a financial guarantee by tomorrow afternoon. My insurance cap is blown. I don't have the money, Valerie. I don't have it." Valerie closed her eyes. The calculation assembled itself in her mind with terrifying speed. The $2 million check was still sitting uncashed. The Apex acquisition deadline was Monday morning. Harrison's blackmail threat was still active. She squeezed his hand. She sat up straight. The Ice Queen returned, but this time the cold, ruthless logic was not directed at a corporate rival. It was deployed to save the man sitting beside her. "I am going to fix this." Valerie's voice was forged steel. "I will call Harrison right now. I will tell him I am resigning tomorrow morning, citing immediate health concerns. I will sign the executive proxy handing him the CEO position. I will authorize the Apex acquisition." James lifted his head. He stared at her through bloodshot eyes. "What are you doing?" "I am cutting the losses." Valerie looked directly at him. "If I surrender the company to him entirely, he has no reason to detonate the scandal. He gets the throne. He gets his $5 million. In exchange, he buries the photographs, and he processes my golden parachute severance package by wire transfer at 9 a.m. tomorrow. It will be over $12 million. I will transfer the funds directly to the hospital billing department by noon. Chloe gets the surgery. It was the ultimate executive sacrifice. She was trading her father's empire, her entire identity, and her professional reputation to purchase his daughter's life. She was stepping on the grenade to shield him from the blast. "No!" The refusal was soft, but it possessed the density of a collapsing star. Valerie blinked, stunned. "James, this is not a negotiation. It is basic survival mathematics. We have run out of time. We have run out of leverage. I have the power to write the check. Let me save her." James pulled his hand away from hers. He stood up. His suit was wrinkled. His eyes were shadowed with exhaustion, but the core of the man, the unbreakable moral titanium that Nora had loved, the integrity that terrified Harrison, was fully ignited. "You don't save her by validating a thief." James looked down at the CEO. "If you surrender to Harrison, you teach him that terrorism works. You hand him the keys to an empire built by thousands of honest people so he can strip it for parts. You buy my daughter's heart with blood money stolen from the pension funds of our own employees." "I don't care about the pension funds!" Valerie stood up, her voice echoing in the empty waiting room. "I care about the little girl in that trauma bay. I care about you. I am trying to protect you." "Caring looks different from controlling. We fight this right." Valerie stared at him. The absolute moral clarity of his statement stripped away her desperate executive logic. "How?" Her voice broke. The tears threatened to spill again. "How do we fight a man holding all the cards when the clock hits 0 tomorrow afternoon? He doesn't hold all the cards." James checked his wristwatch. Midnight. "He only thinks he does. He thinks we are paralyzed by fear. He thinks I am too worried about my daughter to finish the forensic trace. He is going to push for the kill tomorrow." "What are you going to do?" "I am going to turn the lights on." James turned toward the elevator. "Stay with Chloe. If she wakes up, tell her daddy is fighting the bad guys. I will be back before the surgical window closes. He walked out of the hospital, stepping into the freezing Chicago night. The fear was still there, a massive, heavy weight in his gut. But the panic was gone. It had been replaced by a cold, surgical precision. Friday morning, 8 a.m. The email hit every inbox at Sterling Acquisitions simultaneously. It bypassed the standard internal communication filters. The sender was anonymous, routed through a proxy server in Eastern Europe, but the author's identity was undeniable to anyone who understood the corporate dynamics. The subject line: compromised leadership and fiduciary negligence. The body of the email was a masterpiece of character assassination. It outlined a highly speculative, yet devastatingly plausible narrative. It suggested that a senior analyst, James Brooks, had engaged in a systematic campaign of inappropriate personal leverage with the CEO, Valerie Sterling. It alleged that this relationship had compromised the internal risk assessment division, specifically pointing to the delayed authorization of the highly lucrative Apex acquisition. It ended with a demand for immediate board intervention to protect shareholder value from a compromised executive team. It was Harrison's opening salvo. He hadn't attached the photographs. He was holding the visual proof in reserve, using the rumor mill to prime the explosion. At 8:15 a.m., the chairman of the board called an emergency session for 2 p.m. in the executive boardroom. At 8:30 a.m., human resources personnel, flanked by corporate security, arrived at James's cubicle. They carried a standard cardboard box. "Mr. Brooks?" The HR director looked incredibly uncomfortable. "Pending an immediate internal investigation into the allegations circulated this morning. Your access to the Sterling network has been suspended. You are to be escorted from the building. You are on paid administrative leave." It was standard protocol. It was also Harrison's way of neutralizing the threat. He was removing James from the battlefield before the 2 p.m. board meeting. James did not argue. He did not cause a scene. He calmly placed his framed photograph of Nora into the cardboard box. He packed his ergonomic keyboard. He ignored the stares of the 50 analysts watching the public humiliation. He walked to the elevators flanked by the security guards. He maintained perfect posture. He did not look defeated. He looked like a man executing a highly complex maneuver. They escorted him to the lobby and out through the revolving glass doors. The cold wind off Lake Michigan hit his face. He didn't go to the hospital. He knew Valerie was sitting by Chloe's bed, maintaining the vigil. He needed to secure the weapon. He took the L train back to the suburbs. He walked into his empty house. The quiet was absolute. He unpacked the cardboard box. He took the encrypted flash drive from his pocket. He booted up his personal laptop on the kitchen table, right next to the spot where Chloe had spilled the orange juice. Harrison thought cutting his network access would stop the investigation. Harrison fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the man he was fighting. James didn't need the Sterling internal network. He had already downloaded the raw, unencrypted ledger data of the Cayman Trust 3 days ago. What he needed now was the final, undeniable linkage. He needed to prove, beyond a shadow of a legal doubt, that Harrison Cole was the sole beneficiary of the offshore shell company. James cracked his knuckles. He opened a secure command line interface. He bypassed the standard DNS protocols, routing his connection through a series of dark web nodes to mask his location. He began brute forcing the public registry firewalls of the Cayman Banking Authority. It was a race against the clock, 10 a.m. He found the secondary holding corporation that owned the blind trust, 11:30 a.m. He breached a low-level administrative server connected to the law firm that handled Harrison's divorce. He cross-referenced the digital signatures on the incorporation documents with the digitized divorce settlement papers. 1:15 p.m. The physical toll of the all-nighter and the crushing stress manifested. James's vision blurred. A migraine spiked behind his right eye. His hands shook over the keyboard. He thought about the pediatric ICU. He thought about the heart monitor tracing the erratic green line. You can rebuild a company, you cannot rebuild a soul. He pushed through the pain. He ran a final SQL injection query against the metadata of the offshore routing transfers. At 1:38 p.m., the screen populated with the result. It was a single undeniable string of alphanumeric code, an internal Sterling Acquisitions employee authorization key. It was embedded in the metadata of the wire transfer instructions setting up the Apex Shell Company. The authorization key belonged to Harrison Cole. The CFO had made one microscopic mistake in his digital architecture. He had used his internal company credentials to test the initial offshore routing ping 3 years ago, leaving a permanent, indestructible digital fingerprint on the crime scene. James hit print. The laser printer in the corner of the kitchen whirred to life, spitting out 40 pages of absolute, undeniable truth. He grabbed the stack of hot paper. He slid them into a manila folder. He grabbed his coat. It was 1:45 p.m. The emergency board meeting started in 15 minutes. Harrison was about to demand the CEO's resignation and present himself as the savior of the company. Truth does not negotiate with leverage. James slammed the front door behind him, sprinting toward his sedan. He was going to turn the lights on. The speedometer needle trembled near 80. Rainwater sprayed in violent arcs from the sedan's tires, washing over the concrete barriers of the Kennedy Expressway. The engine whined, a high-pitched mechanical scream protesting the abuse, but James kept his foot pinned to the floorboard. The 40 pages inside the manila folder burned against the passenger seat fabric. They possessed a physical gravity. They were the antidote to the poison currently spreading through the 45th floor of the Sterling Acquisitions Tower. His vision narrowed to the wet asphalt and the brake lights bleeding into the gray afternoon. The migraine throbbed behind his right eye, a relentless percussion perfectly synchronized with his racing pulse. Every minute lost in traffic was a minute Harrison Cole spent cementing his corporate coup. Every second delayed was a second closer to the expiration of Chloe's surgical window. The stakes had transcended professional survival. This was a battle for blood. He abandoned the vehicle in a loading zone a block from the glass and steel skyscraper. The icy wind off Lake Michigan cut through his suit jacket, but he didn't feel the cold. He moved with the terrifying, absolute focus of an apex predator tracking a scent. He bypassed the main revolving doors. His magnetic identification badge had been deactivated by human resources hours ago. The electronic turnstiles in the grand lobby would flash red, triggering an immediate security response. He navigated the rain-slicked alleyway behind the building, approaching the subterranean freight entrance. The loading dock smelled of wet cardboard and diesel exhaust. A solitary logistics manager in a high-visibility vest sat in the security booth, watching a muted television screen. James recognized the man, Marcus. They had shared elevator rides and brief conversations about local sports teams for the better part of a decade. James did not attempt to sneak past. He walked directly up to the reinforced glass window. "James?" Marcus looked up, surprise registering on his weathered face. "HR sent a building-wide alert this morning. Your face is on the restricted access matrix. I am supposed to call the tactical response team if you step foot on the property." "I am not here to damage the building, Marcus." James placed his hands flat on the stainless steel counter beneath the glass. "I am here to stop a robbery. The man orchestrating my suspension is currently attempting to steal $5 million from the corporate pension fund. He is sitting in the executive boardroom right now." Marcus stared at the analyst. The logistics manager had witnessed countless executives come and go. Arrogant men in expensive suits who treated the support staff like invisible machinery. James Brooks had always been different. He had always offered a genuine greeting, a respectful acknowledgement of shared humanity. The integrity radiating from James was palpable, heavy, and undeniably authentic. The freight elevator requires a manual override key from this booth. Marcus slowly reached toward the panel of switches on his console. If they check the digital logs, they will see I bypassed the biometric scanner. Character is the only currency that survives a fire. James held the man's gaze, offering no bribes, only the absolute weight of truth. I am walking into the fire. I need you to open the door. Marcus looked at the manila folder clutched in James's hand. He looked at the unwavering determination in the analyst's bloodshot eyes. He flipped the heavy toggle switch. A loud metallic clack echoed through the concrete loading dock. The heavy steel doors of the service elevator slid open. The service car goes directly to the 44th floor utility corridor. Marcus didn't look back at the television. You will have to take the fire stairs for the last flight. Make it count, Mr. Brooks. Thank you. James stepped into the cavernous, unpolished steel box. The ascent was agonizingly slow. The industrial motors groaned, pulling him upward through the skeletal core of the skyscraper. He checked his wristwatch. 1:56 p.m. The emergency board session was already underway. Harrison would be delivering his opening remarks, painting the masterpiece of his fabricated narrative. He would be presenting himself as the stabilizing force, the ethical savior stepping in to rescue the firm from a compromised female CEO and a predatory minority employee. The elevator ground to a halt on the 44th floor. James sprinted down the narrow, dimly lit utility corridor. He hit the heavy metal door of the fire stairwell with his shoulder. The impact bruised his collarbone, but the adrenaline masked the pain. He took the concrete steps 2 at a time. The air in the stairwell was stale and hot. He reached the 45th floor landing. He paused for a fraction of a second, his hand resting on the brushed steel handle. He closed his eyes. He pictured Chloe lying in the trauma bay, the fragile rhythm of her failing heart traced in glowing green lines on the monitor. He pictured Valerie stripped of her corporate armor, terrified and alone, preparing to sacrifice her legacy to save a child she barely knew. Fear is a loud liar. James pushed the door open. He stepped into the hushed, expensive silence of the executive suite. The thick carpet absorbed the sound of his footsteps. The reception area was empty, the administrative assistants likely banished to maintain absolute confidentiality for the emergency session. He walked toward the massive double mahogany doors at the end of the hall. The brass handles gleamed under the recessed lighting. From behind the heavy wood, Harrison's voice bled into the hallway. The acoustic dampening could not entirely contain the CFO's arrogant theatrical projection. Fiduciary responsibility to our shareholders demands immediate and decisive action. The allegations of inappropriate leverage, combined with the catastrophic delays in the Apex acquisition risk modeling, indicate a systemic failure of leadership at the highest level. We cannot allow personal indiscretions to jeopardize market confidence. James gripped both brass handles. He did not knock. He threw his entire weight backward, pulling the doors open with a violent, synchronized motion. The heavy mahogany swung outward, hitting the wall stops with a sound like a gunshot. The executive boardroom was a theater of power. A massive table carved from a single piece of ancient walnut dominated the space. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic god's-eye view of the gray, rain-swept Chicago skyline. 14 board members, men and women possessing staggering generational wealth and absolute corporate authority, sat frozen in their high-backed leather chairs. At the head of the table stood Harrison Cole, his hand resting on a sleek digital presentation remote. In the far corner, isolated from the group, sat Valerie Sterling. Her face was chalk white. She looked like a prisoner awaiting a predetermined execution. Her eyes widened in absolute shock as James materialized in the doorway. What is the meaning of this? The chairman of the board, an imposing man with silver hair and a tailored charcoal suit, half rose from his seat. Security was specifically instructed to secure this floor. This individual's access was revoked this morning. Harrison recovered quickly, his voice sharp, masking a sudden micro-expression of absolute panic. He is an active threat. Someone call the tactical response desk immediately. James ignored the CFO. He walked directly into the room, his stride measuring the distance to the center of the walnut table. He did not look like a defeated, suspended employee. He moved with the undeniable authority of a man who held the executioner's axe. He reached the table. He slammed the thick manila folder onto the polished wood. The sound echoed off the glass walls. "My name is James Brooks. I am the senior risk analyst you just suspended." James projected his voice, filling the massive architectural space without shouting. "And I am here to fulfill the fiduciary duty that your chief financial officer abandoned 3 years ago. Get him out of here." Harrison pointed a trembling finger at the door. "He is erratic. He is under investigation for extortion and gross professional misconduct. Nothing he says has any legal standing in this chamber." "If my presence is irrelevant, Harrison, let them look at the paper." James did not break eye contact with the board members. "If I am simply a disgruntled employee, the data in that folder will prove it. But if you call security before the chairman reads the first page, every person in this room becomes an accessory to a $5 million federal wire fraud conspiracy." The word fraud sucked the remaining oxygen from the room. The board members exchanged nervous, calculated glances. Wealthy individuals possessed a visceral, biological aversion to federal investigations. The chairman looked at Harrison, then looked at the manila folder. He slowly sat back down. He reached out and opened the cover. "This is an outrage." Harrison stepped away from his presentation screen, his composure fracturing. "Valerie, control your asset. This is a desperate, pathetic attempt to deflect from the evidence of your inappropriate relationship." Valerie did not look at Harrison. She looked entirely at James. The Ice Queen was gone. In her place sat a woman witnessing the manifestation of absolute, uncompromising integrity. She realized he had not run, he had not taken the buyout. He had marched into the slaughterhouse to tear it down with his bare hands. "The first document you are reading, Mr. Chairman, is the network routing log for the anonymous emails sent to this board at 8 o'clock this morning." James spoke with surgical precision, narrating the data as the chairman turned the pages. "The email alleging my misconduct was routed through a proxy server in Estonia. However, the purchase order for that specific proxy server subscription was billed to a corporate American Express card." James paused, letting the silence stretch tight. "Harrison Cole's corporate American Express card. The receipt is on page 3. A collective murmur rippled down the length of the walnut table. Several board members leaned forward, straining to see the documents. The chairman's silver eyebrows narrowed. He flipped to page 3. He stared at the itemized credit card log. "A careless mistake." James kept his focus locked on the CFO. "But arrogance breeds carelessness. Harrison fabricated the entire narrative of extortion to create a smokescreen. He needed you distracted by a moral scandal so you would force through the Apex acquisition today without reviewing the underlying risk models." "Lies." Harrison spat the word, though his face had drained of all color. "Fabricated digital records. He is a data analyst. He manipulates numbers for a living. He forged the receipts to save his job." "Turn to page 7, Mr. Chairman." James ignored the desperation. "The incorporation documents for Apex Logistics. It is not a functioning mid-sized firm. It is a hollow corporate shell, registered in Delaware, with all assets immediately transferring to a holding company in the Cayman Islands." The chairman turned the pages. The crisp sound of the heavy bond paper was the loudest noise in the room. "On page 12, you will find the deep web registry for the blind trust controlling the Cayman Holding Company." James stepped closer to the table, dominating the physical space. "The registered legal agent for the trust is a partner at the Chicago law firm of Miller and Hayes. That same partner, according to the court filings on page 14, represented Harrison Cole in his divorce proceedings 24 months ago. Coincidence? Harrison gripped the back of his leather chair. His knuckles were bone white. Half the executives in this city use Miller and Hayes. This is a sequence of circumstantial delusions constructed by a desperate man. Circumstance is a shadow. James's voice dropped to a low, resonant timbre that commanded absolute silence. Metadata is a spotlight. Turn to page 39. The chairman flipped to the back of the thick dossier. He stared at the dense block of alphanumeric code printed across the page. When Harrison initiated the primary offshore routing architecture for the Apex Shell Company 3 years ago, he ran a systemic ping to verify the routing numbers. James unspooled the final fatal thread of the digital trap. He used a masked IP address, but he authorized the ping through the Sterling internal network. The metadata of that initial test transfer contains a permanent, unalterable employee authorization key. James turned slowly, facing Harrison. The predator had finally become the prey. That authorization key is 44 Alpha 79 Omega. James recited the code from memory. It is the primary digital signature of the chief financial officer. It is the undeniable mathematical proof that Harrison Cole built the Apex acquisition specifically to embezzle $5 million of shareholder capital. The silence in the boardroom was absolute, possessing the density of a black hole. It swallowed the rain hitting the windows. It swallowed Harrison's manufactured outrage. The chairman looked up from page 39. He looked at Harrison. The silver-haired executive did not yell. He did not curse. His voice was terrifyingly calm. "Is this your authorization key, Harrison?" Harrison's mouth opened, but no sound emerged. His eyes darted toward the mahogany doors. The flight response had completely overridden his executive programming. The bespoke Navy suit suddenly looked like a prison uniform. He had spent years building the perfect corporate crime, leveraging systemic biases and utilizing the firm's own moral rigidities as a weapon. He had calculated every variable except the uncompromising moral architecture of a grieving father. This is an orchestrated hit," Harrison stammered, the words hollow, lacking any structural integrity. "Valerie put him up to this. She is trying to destroy me to protect her own catastrophic failures." Valerie Sterling stood up. She did not use the table for support. She stepped out of the shadows of the corner, moving into the direct light of the panoramic windows. She looked at the man who had tormented her, blackmailed her, and threatened the life of her unborn child. She felt no fear. The Ice Queen was dead, but the woman standing in her place was forged from something infinitely stronger. "My personal life is not a liability to this firm, Harrison." Valerie's voice rang with absolute resonant authority. "But your theft is a federal crime. You attempted to leverage my privacy to blind the board to your embezzlement. You failed because you fundamentally misunderstood the people you were trying to destroy." She turned to the chairman. "I recommend immediate termination with cause, the freezing of all his corporate assets, and the immediate dispatch of this entire dossier to the federal prosecutor's office in the Northern District of Illinois." The chairman nodded slowly. He pressed a button on the intercom console embedded in the walnut table. "Send corporate security and the tactical response team to the boardroom immediately. We have a hostile individual requiring escort to the authorities." Harrison staggered backward. He bumped into the floor-to-ceiling glass. He looked at the gray abyss of the city plunging 45 stories down. He looked back at James. The pure, unadulterated hatred in his eyes was visceral. "You think you won?" Harrison sneered, his upper lip curling. "You think you saved her? The board still knows. They know about the clinic. They know you slept your way into a payout. You are still a parasite, Brooks. You are nothing." James didn't flinch. The venom simply washed over his armor, finding no purchase. He had survived the death of his wife. He was surviving the terrifying illness of his daughter. The insults of a broken, corrupt man were meaningless static. Intent doesn't erase impact. James delivered the final blow with quiet, devastating clarity. You intended to break us. You only revealed how incredibly fragile you are. The heavy mahogany doors swung open. 4 members of the tactical response team, clad in dark suits and earpieces, flooded into the room. They flanked Harrison immediately, gripping his arms with professional, unyielding force. The CFO did not struggle. The fight had completely drained from his posture. He was a hollow man being marched toward a concrete cell. They dragged him out. The doors clicked shut. The immediate aftermath in the boardroom felt like the atmosphere following a violent thunderstorm. The air was charged, crackling with unresolved energy. The 14 board members sat in stunned silence, processing the catastrophic near miss of the Apex acquisition. The chairman closed the manila folder. He slid it carefully to the center of the table. He looked at James, taking the true measure of the analyst for the first time. He saw the wrinkled suit, the deep shadows under the eyes, the unmistakable aura of a man pushed to the absolute limits of human endurance. "Mr. Brooks." The chairman's voice held a new, profound respect. "Your suspension is immediately rescinded with full back pay and a formal apology from this governing body. Your actions today saved Sterling Acquisitions from a catastrophic financial and public relations disaster. We are entirely in your debt. I did not do it for the firm." James picked up the empty folder. "I did it because it was the truth." He turned toward Valerie. Their eyes met across the massive expanse of the walnut table. The corporate battlefield faded into insignificance. The only reality that mattered was the ticking clock in the pediatric trauma bay miles away. "I have to go," James whispered, the exhaustion finally bleeding through his stoic facade. "The surgical window." Valerie didn't hesitate. She looked at the chairman. "I am taking an immediate, indefinite leave of absence. The firm is secure, the Apex deal is dead, my priorities are no longer within these walls." She didn't wait for permission or a vote. She walked around the table, her heels clicking decisively against the hardwood floor. She joined James at the door. Together they walked out of the executive suite, leaving the board members in silent contemplation of the astonishing display of human character they had just witnessed. The return journey to Northwestern Memorial was a blur of frantic motion. Valerie drove her private vehicle, a sleek black sedan, navigating the sluggish afternoon traffic with a reckless, aggressive desperation. James sat in the passenger seat, his hands trembling slightly, the adrenaline crash hitting his nervous system with brutal force. He stared blindly at the dashboard clock. 3:15 p.m. "We missed the deadline." James's voice was hollow. "Dr. Eris needed the financial guarantee by 2 o'clock. The billing department will have released the surgical theater to the next critical patient." Valerie didn't take her eyes off the road. She gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles pale. "The theater is secure. The surgical team is prepping her right now." James turned his head slowly. The cognitive processing speed of the brilliant analyst faltered. "What? How?" "I wired the funds." Valerie merged violently into the fast lane, ignoring the blaring horn of a passing taxi. "From my personal holding account, $750,000. It cleared the hospital's financial compliance office at 1:30 this afternoon." James stared at her profile. The elegant line of her jaw, the fierce concentration in her hazel eyes. She had wired the money before the board meeting, before she knew if James had successfully decrypted the Cayman Island routing numbers, before she knew if Harrison would detonate the photographs and destroy her career. She had authorized the transfer when she believed she was about to lose everything. "You paid the bill before you knew if we won." James breathed the words, struggling to comprehend the magnitude of the sacrifice. "We don't buy miracles, we earn them." Valerie glanced at him, a fierce, wet shine in her eyes. "I couldn't control the board, I couldn't control Harrison, but I could control the wire transfer. I chose Chloe, I chose us, regardless of the fallout." The profound weight of her actions settled over him. Nora had told him once in the final weeks that love was not a feeling, but a series of terrifying, irreversible actions. Valerie Sterling had just executed the most terrifying action of her life, stepping completely out of her armor and throwing herself onto the grenade for a child she had met exactly once. They arrived at the hospital, abandoning the car in the VIP parking garage. They sprinted through the sterile corridors, following the colored lines painted on the linoleum floor toward the pediatric cardiovascular surgical waiting wing. The room was aggressively beige, filled with uncomfortable vinyl chairs and outdated magazines. The silence here was different from the corporate silence. It was a suffocating, heavy blanket woven from sheer terror and desperate hope. James collapsed into a chair near the corner. He buried his face in his hands. The physical reality of the scalpel opening his daughter's chest paralyzed him. Valerie sat next to him. She didn't offer empty reassurances. She didn't say everything would be fine. She simply intertwined her fingers with his, anchoring him to the physical world while his mind spiraled into the surgical theater. The wait was a psychological torture stretching across 6 agonizing hours. The sun set over Chicago, casting long, bruised shadows across the hospital courtyard. Visible through the waiting room window, nurses changed shifts. The ambient noise of the hospital hummed and clicked. Valerie did not let go of his hand. She sat with perfect, unwavering stillness, a silent sentinel sharing the crushing burden of his fear. At 10:45 p.m., the heavy double doors of the surgical wing swung open. Dr. Aris emerged. He wore green surgical scrubs, the fabric dark with sweat around the collar. He pulled down his surgical mask, revealing a face deeply lined with exhaustion. James stood up. His legs felt like liquid. The air vanished from the room. Dr. Aris looked at the terrified father. The surgeon's rigid posture relaxed by a fraction of an inch. A small, incredibly profound smile touched the corners of his mouth. The mitral valve has been completely replaced with a mechanical prosthetic. Dr. Aris spoke the beautiful, sterile words of medical victory. The regurgitation is entirely resolved. Her heart function is returning to normal baseline parameters. She handled the bypass machine exceptionally well. It was a flawless procedure, Mr. Brooks. She is going to be perfectly fine. The tension holding James's skeletal structure together snapped. He fell back into the vinyl chair, completely undone. He wept, his shoulders shaking with the violent, consuming relief of a parent handed their child's life back from the edge of the abyss. Valerie covered her mouth with her free hand, the tears streaming freely down her face. She looked at the surgeon, nodding her profound gratitude, unable to form words. "She is in the pediatric recovery unit," Dr. Aris added gently. "She will be heavily sedated until morning. You can sit with her, but she won't wake up for several hours. You both look like you haven't slept in days. I suggest you get some coffee and breathe." They thanked the surgeon, their voices raw and broken. They walked to the recovery unit, standing outside the glass partition. Chloe lay in the center of the bed, surrounded by monitors. The tubes were still there, but the erratic green line on the cardiac screen had transformed into a steady, rhythmic, beautiful pulse. The bluish tint was gone from her lips, replaced by a healthy, oxygenated pink. James placed his hand against the cold glow. The nightmare was over. They retreated to the hospital cafeteria on the ground floor. The massive room was deserted at midnight. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead. They sat in a corner booth, 2 steaming styrofoam cups of terrible black coffee sitting untouched on the laminate table between them. The adrenaline had completely evaporated, leaving behind a raw, unshielded intimacy. They had fought a war on 2 fronts and survived. The corporate monster was caged and the biological monster was defeated. Valerie stared at her reflection in the dark surface of the coffee. The tailored silk blouse was wrinkled. Her hair was a mess. The immaculate CEO did not exist in this room. "I don't want to go back," Valerie whispered. The words felt incredibly heavy, a confession pulled from the deepest, most guarded vault of her psyche. James looked at her across the table. To the executive suite? To any of it. She traced the rim of the styrofoam cup. "For 20 years I built a fortress of competence to ensure nobody could ever hurt me. I believed vulnerability was a mathematical error. I believed needing someone was a fatal flaw in the architecture of my life." She looked up, meeting his exhausted, intense gaze. "Watching you clean that floor in the kitchen." Valerie's voice trembled, stripped of all executive resonance. "Listening to you demand the truth from Harrison. Sitting in that waiting room, terrified that I was going to lose a little girl I barely know. It broke the fortress, it broke all of it." She reached across the table, her hands finding his, gripping them with desperate honesty. "I don't want to be the ice queen anymore, James. I don't want the corner office if it means sitting in it alone. I want the messy, terrifying chaos I saw in your living room. I want to read the stories and do the monster voices. I want to be a mother to the life growing inside me, and I want to be a mother to the little girl sleeping upstairs." She swallowed hard, the final absolute truth hovering on her lips. "I want you." James stared at the woman sitting across from him. He saw the complete surrender of her defensive programming. He saw the raw, beautiful courage required to dismantle a lifetime of fear and offer herself entirely to another human being. He thought about Nora, and he knew with absolute certainty that she would recognize the profound grace in this moment. You cannot outrun the architecture of your own soul. Valerie had stopped running. James didn't offer a polite reassurance. He demanded the final cementing of the transformation. "Look at me." James's voice was deep, commanding, yet infinitely tender. Valerie lifted her chin, her hazel eyes wet with tears locked onto his. "Say it again." James squeezed her hands. Valerie took a shuddering breath. The fear was still there, but it was no longer driving the vehicle. The courage had taken the wheel. "I want you." Valerie's voice was clear, ringing with undeniable conviction. "I want our family. I am not hiding anymore." James smiled, a slow, genuine smile that reached his eyes, banishing the shadows of the past 4 years. He stood up, pulling her out of the booth. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her against his chest. She buried her face in his shoulder, inhaling the scent of his cologne and the antiseptic hospital air. They held each other in the deserted cafeteria, two damaged people who had walked through the fire and forged something unbreakable on the other side. 2 years later, Saturday morning sunlight streamed through the bay windows of a spacious, chaotic kitchen in the Chicago suburbs. The rain and the cold gray shadows were distant memories. The air smelled of vanilla, browned butter, and the distinct, slightly metallic scent of freshly sharpened crayons. James stood at the massive marble island, flipping a pancake with practiced ease. He wore a faded college t-shirt and comfortable sweatpants. The deep lines of exhaustion that had once defined his face were gone, replaced by the relaxed, confident aura of a man standing squarely in the center of his own hard-earned happiness. At the large oak dining table, Chloe sat surrounded by a sea of construction paper. She was 8 years old. She wore a bright yellow sundress. A faint, jagged scar peeked over the collarbone of her dress. A badge of honor she showed off to anyone who asked. Her cheeks were flushed with healthy color. The gap in her teeth had been replaced by a slightly crooked, permanent adult incisor. "The dragon needs more fire, Daddy," Chloe announced, holding up a drawing dominated by violent swirls of red and orange crayon. "He is protecting the castle." "Give him some purple fire, Bug," James suggested, sliding a golden pancake onto a ceramic plate. "Dragons like purple." "That is biologically inaccurate." Valerie walked into the kitchen. She wore yoga pants and an oversized sweater. Her hair was pulled into a messy bun. She held a sleeping 6-month-old baby boy against her chest, the infant named Thomas after the chairman who had believed in the truth. possessed a head of thick, dark curls and a terrifyingly loud set of lungs that were thankfully quiet at the moment. Valerie was no longer the CEO of Sterling Acquisitions. She had transitioned to the board of directors, retaining her equity but surrendering the daily operational control. She had traded the corner office for the corner of the sofa, and she had never regretted the transaction for a single second. James walked over to his wife. He kissed her softly on the forehead, then kissed the sleeping baby's cheek. He handed her a mug of decaffeinated coffee. "Did he sleep through the night?" James whispered, mindful of the fragile silence. "From 2 o'clock until 6. Valerie smiled, the exhaustion in her eyes entirely different from the toxic corporate fatigue she used to carry. This was the beautiful, purposeful exhaustion of motherhood. "He is dreaming about something serious. He has your analytical frown. He is calculating the pancake to syrup ratio," James joked, wrapping an arm around her waist. They stood together in the sunlit kitchen, watching their daughter furiously adding purple flames to a cardboard dragon. The medical debt was gone, cleared by the massive settlement resulting from Harrison Cole's federal conviction. The CFO was currently serving a 10-year sentence in a minimum security facility in downstate Illinois. The corporate world continued its brutal, relentless churning, but it no longer dictated the rhythm of their lives. Chloe finished her masterpiece. She jumped up from the table, a blur of yellow fabric and relentless energy. She ran over and hugged Valerie around the waist, careful not to squash her baby brother. "Look!" Chloe held up the drawing. It wasn't just a dragon. Behind the fierce, purple flaming beast stood a castle, and standing on the balcony of the castle, drawn with meticulous 6-year-old precision, was a stick figure wearing a crown. But the jagged red storm clouds were gone, replaced by a massive smiling yellow sun. "The lady with a big smile," Chloe pointed to the figure, "because the dragon scared the rain away." Valerie touched the drawing, her heart swelling with an emotion so massive it threatened to crack her ribs. She looked at James, the brilliant analyst, the grieving widower, the man who had refused to compromise his dignity when the entire world demanded his surrender. He had not just saved his daughter's life, he had saved Valerie's soul. He had proven the absolute fundamental truth that the world desperately tried to obscure. A good man, standing firmly in the light, holding his character above his comfort, could tear down a corrupt empire and build a kingdom of love in its ruins. James smiled back at her, his eyes reflecting the warm, golden light of the Saturday morning. The journey had exacted a heavy toll, demanding sacrifice and terrifying vulnerability. But standing in the chaotic, beautiful noise of his kitchen, holding his wife and watching his healthy children, James knew the ultimate equation balanced perfectly. The dignity had been maintained, the truth had won, the ending was earned.